Lassiter. Dr. Lassiter joined Rowan just this fall 2020 as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. He completed his bachelor's in psychology at Georgia College and State University and his PhD in clinical psychology at the Alliant International University in San Francisco. He is the founder and chief psychology officer at Lassiter Health Initiatives, the co-host of Fly on the Wall, and an artistic associate at the Black Acting Methods Studio. So please welcome Dr. Lassiter.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be in conversation with you all today. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in and talking about my road to research. So I entitled this talk, Spiritual and Psychological Intersectionality in Research and Thought. That is the name of my research lab, but it also really encompasses what I'm about, who I am, and the work that I hope to fulfill in the world. So let's get into it. All right, so we're going to start off with who am I, how I got here, what I do, and where I'm going, at least where I hope I'm going. So who am I? So I always tell people that I am proud to be the grandson of a sharecropper. So my father's father, this guy right here, my father, was a sharecropper. And my father owned his own business as an exterminator. And I became a clinical psychologist. So within just a generation, we went from the fields to the academy, I always like to say. And so I am so honored more than anything else to carry on the heritage of such strong, resilient people. My mom, my dad, and my ancestors, their parents. I'm so honored to carry on that heritage and to bring our family legacy, our family name into spaces that their parents and my parents could not ever imagine being able to be. The fact that people call me Dr. Lassiter is a testament to them and my heritage. So I always start there. I am an uncle. I have 8 currently. I have 8 nephews and nieces. I am also a nerd. I've always been a nerd. You'll see in this picture right here, this is me in pre-K. And I went to it's called Barton Chapel Pre-K. So it's a Christian affiliated school, but love learning from a very, very early age. So I own my nerddom. I always like to tell people they used to pick on me for being a nerd and now I get a paycheck for it. So life comes around. I am also a dancer. I'm an artistic person. I'm a dancer and choreographer. Not so much actively anymore. Grad school kind of tapered some of that as well as the pandemic, but hopefully afterwards getting back into that. But dance has always been a big part of my life. The arts have always been a big part of my life. Mostly thanks to Michael Jackson from a very early age, and then Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, these men who were big into arts, expressing themselves through their bodies. And as I get into the talk, you'll hear how this emphasis on emotional expression and the somatic still plays a big part in my work today. One of the things that I had the opportunity to do that I was very proud of is to start my own dance company in New York City while I was on my postdoctoral training after getting my PhD. And so this picture down here, it's me and my assistant artistic director, who's also my cousin. But we had a really good run for about 3 years in New York City, creating and presenting our dance works. So all of these parts make up who I am. I'm also a friend, and I'm also one of my things that brings me the most joy is being father to two baby girls, Nala and Minerva. Those are my heart. They are the ones that bring a smile to my face. I just watch them walk and I'm immediately excited. I'm immediately calm. And so that's a big part of my life today. I'm also a friend. These are two of my best friends right here. This was actually my 37th birthday here. We went out to eat before the pandemic. And so this is, I'm a friend, but I'm also now in my professional capacity. As you heard, I do a lot of different things. But part of what that is, I call myself a polymath because, as you can tell, I'm a person of many different talents, and they all come together to help people heal and thrive. But I've been really getting into expanding my platform in order to bring awareness to the concerns and strengths as well as challenges of Black LGBT communities in particular. And so I've been able to be interviewed by various different news platforms as well as radio platforms and so on and so forth. So I'm very honored to do that. So this is just a snapshot of who I am. But at the end of the day, I'm just a human being. And as you'll see over here, sometimes I'm silly, sometimes I get stressed out, but I'm a human being. And I start here because I always encourage my students. I always encourage my mentees. I encourage my clients as a clinical psychologist. I see patients to bring their full selves to everything that they do. That is where the healing is. That is where the growth is. That is how we thrive. It's bringing our full selves without apologizing for it into everything that we do. And so that's what I strive to do every day. And that's what I also hope to impart in others. And you'll see it in my work, my road to research as I continue to share. So I want to talk about some of my early influences. So as I said, I am the grandson of a sharecropper, the son of a pest control exterminator who had his own business, the son of a mother who did foster care. Her doing foster care was when I first really started to understand, get a glimpse of what mental illness was. I did not know, I did not have the language at that time, but that's what I was seeing. And I am the son of very religious people. I grew up in a very religious household in Augusta, Georgia, the home of James Brown and the Masters, right? And so I grew up in a very religious household. And I always tell people that as a child, I was religious. And I say that to say that sometimes people grow up religious, they may grow up in a religious household. They may go to church because that's what the family does, that's the family norm, but the belief system is here or there. I was devout. I was devout. And I think part of my devotion to growing up, particularly in a Black Christian setting and those Black Christian beliefs, was because of the ways in which illness and oppression affected my life from a very early age. So I was born with sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is a disorder of the red blood cells where they basically don't get enough oxygen and they sickle and they can cause pain and all types of things. And from a very early age, I suffered a lot. And it was very hard for me to make sense of my illness as a child. But again, growing up in that religious household, my mother would always pray with me. And she would say that God is here with us and God is going to use all of this to your benefit. And being on this side of things where my health is so much better, and I use all of those experiences in my work looking at health inequities, looking at health psychology, looking at how people thrive through illness. All of those things really are testament to what my mom was saying when I was a very young child. The other early influence was understanding myself as a Black person. My racial identity has always been very clear and at the forefront of how I understood myself from a very early age. It was actually my pediatrician, and when I was like in first grade, who gave me this book you see on the screen. And it was called Afro Bets, Book of Black Heroes from A to Z. And it was a book that had on each page the letter, the alphabet, and then a Black hero, pioneer, scientist, activist, teacher who shared that in alphabet letter. So it went from A to Z. And I read this book over and over and over and over and over again. Because again, remember, I was a nerd from way back, right? So I loved reading. And so my pediatrician gave me this book. And this book just transformed how I thought about myself as a Black person. And I remember thinking from a very early age, again, combining this with my experience of having sickle cell anemia, I said, if these Black people that went through all of these things, from slavery and colonization on the African continent and slavery in the Western world to Jim Crow, from rape and sterilization and civil rights movement, if they can do all of this, I can do so much more as well. I am in the lineage of these people. These people are very clearly connected to me. And so I can get through racism, I can get through sickle cell, and I can have an impact. So these are my earliest influences. These are my earliest influences. And I knew that I could do all of these things because of my connection to God. Because I grew up believing that God cared about me and that God would give me strength. And I not only believed that, but because I was able to get through those hospitalizations and all the things that happened around my illness, that was proof to me that God was real and that I could get through things. And so I don't mean to preach, right? But I do want to let you know about my earliest influences. And again, bringing all of me into the room, religion was one of those big early influences. Other early influences. So those are the influences sort of within the household that I grew up in. But as I started to get older, I started to, as we all do, start to look at influences outside of my household. And one of the first things that got me interested in health for Black people in particular, beyond my own personal experience and beyond seeing mental health problems with the foster children that my mom and my mom and dad housed, was a book that I came across in high school. At least I believe it was high school. Time goes. But it was called Not in My Family: AIDS in the African American Community. And I remember hearing about HIV and and how big of a deal it was, how disproportionate the rates were in the African American community. And I got this book and I read this book because, again, I'm an avid reader, so I'm reading lots of different types of things. So, and I said, oh my God, like, here's this issue that I hadn't heard about in the African American community. I wonder if this is an area I can go into. And so as I started to think about graduate school, and I'll talk more about my educational journey in just a moment, HIV prevention was one of the things that I thought, this is an area where I can make a difference, because a lot at that time, a lot of Black people were not talking about HIV. There was still a lot of stigma. And I thought, this is an area for growth. This gentleman that you see in the center here, his name is Dr. David Mel Branch. And Dr. David Mel Branch has an MD. He is a medical physician, and he is currently at Morehouse School of Medicine. When I first learned of his work, he was at Emory University, and he openly identifies as a Black gay man who is HIV positive, and he was writing in academic journals that I came across during my later, like senior year of undergraduate and early years of graduate school. But I came across his work, and it was so refreshing. It's that moment of recognition where you read someone's work and you know that they get it. They get the lived experience. And being a Black, same gender loving man myself, when people talked about Black people in the scientific literature at that time and still today, it was always this sense of, you knew that they didn't get it. They highlighted the risk, they highlighted the pathology, but they didn't balance that with the strengths. They didn't balance that with the genius. They didn't balance that with the ways in which Black people thrive, which again, being a Black person, being a Black, sane and loving man, having that foundation as a child, I knew that those things existed alongside with the struggles. And Dr. David Mel Branch's work really highlighted that. And to this day, it influences the ways that I write my peer review papers. It's the ways that I write anything. I am always looking to present a nuanced, strengths-based, culturally grounded perspective of marginalized communities. And Dr. David Mel Branch, that recognition from an early time in my development is really influential in that regard. The other thing that inspired me at an early stage is Kanye West, right? And I say RIP to the old Kanye, because it's a different Kanye than the Kanye I grew up on. But I remember College Dropout, his first album came out in like 2003 or something. And it was like my first year of college. And I have this gift here because it says, I'm so self-conscious. And I was so self-conscious, so self-conscious. And at that time in my life, I was so self-conscious because, again, here I am, this Black man. But around the latter part of high school, early college, I'm coming to terms with my sexual orientation. And I don't really know what to do with that. I don't really know how to be, especially coupling that with my religious upbringing that said that that was wrong. And so I'm trying to figure all of these things out. And Kanye West, hearing him rap about being a college dropout, about wanting to do something to highlight the brilliance, the genius, the achievements of Black people, about his own introspection, really resonated with me. Old Kanye, had this sense of urgency, this sense of belief and drive in himself, but that also acknowledged that self-consciousness. And I had a lot of that at that time in my life. So often as I was in school and I was working towards my degrees, I always thought of them as paper. Rappers talk a lot about getting the paper. And I often thought about getting the paper. I was like, I'm out here the same way that, he's out there grinding. I'm out here grinding. I'm in these classes. I'm the only one that looks like me, but I'm getting it. And I'm going to get get these degrees, get this paper. I'm going to make a difference. And so Kanye was like very influential for me in that regard. So I wanted to start off with really highlighting those sort of informal influences in my life, because that's really what drives me. It's more than any of the training I've had. And that's not to discount the training that I've had, because I always, I don't shy away from, like, I'm well trained. I'm very excited about that. And I don't say it in any sort of arrogant way, but I say it in a way knowing that people that look like me often do not have access, the opportunities, the abilities to be this well trained as I am. So I say that. But the training is not what makes me. Those early influences is what makes me. So how did I get here? So I started off at a fine arts high school, and my fine art was dance, but it was a magnet school. So the focus was always on preparing people for college. So then I went to Georgia College State University, where I majored in psychology, minored in dance, and was on the pre-med track. Because at that time, excuse me, at that time, I thought that I would be a psychiatrist. But then I did a summer medical enrichment program at the University of Chicago's medical school, Pritzker School of Medicine. And I shadowed a psychiatrist, and I found out it was mostly med management. I was like, I don't want to do that. And so, sort of my senior year of college, I learned about research, and I started to do that. And that really got me to thinking of being a clinical psychologist. I also went to the Medical College of Georgia, which is in my hometown of Augusta, Georgia, and did a research apprentice program where I was looking at interleukin 1 beta and asthma. And so those are like sort of the foundational exposure to research as a process that I achieved. So after attending Georgia College State University, getting my Bachelor of Science in Psychology, I knew I wanted to take some time off, which I encourage folks to do, to really get an understanding of the world. Because again, I grew up in that very religious household. I was very sheltered in a lot of ways. And so I was like, I want to learn more about the world. And so I went to New York City to do Americorps. So again, I grew up in a household that was economically strained. So I didn't have a lot of money, but I knew about Americorps. And they were like, we'll give you a stipend. You come up here, you're going to do community health education. So I did that in the Bronx with Bronx Lebanon Hospital. And it was an amazing eye-opening experience. And it really prepared me to go on to graduate school at the California School of Professional Psychology. Now, I want to take a moment here to talk about the California School of Professional Psychology, because it is a professional school and is not a traditional school in the sense that people talk about PhD programs. At that time, I didn't know the difference. I know the difference now, but even because I looked at both traditional schools and professional schools, but a lot of the traditional schools had on their websites things like, if you want to do therapy, this may not be for you. They were really much interested in training people who would be academics. And at that time in my life, I didn't really even realize that clinical psychologists were academics. In my mind, if you were a clinical psychologist, you were seeing patients, you were going out, you were helping people heal, which is what I wanted to do. I was very much interested in giving back to Black LGBT communities and helping them heal. And so I wanted a school that was going to train me to do that. I was also, though, had enough sense from somewhere to know that bias exists. And so even if I go to a professional school, it'd probably be better to get a PhD and not a PsyD, because bias exists. And so I went in and I said, I'm going to get this PhD. And then again, having some understanding of research, I knew that I wanted to do research. I knew I wanted to do HIV prevention. And I knew I wanted to study Black, same gender loving men, and religion. And so I get into this school, and it's great. And it really does offer me the best of both worlds. I got such stellar training as a clinical psychologist doing clinical work. And I also really got good training as a scientist. And one of the things that I'll mention here is that it's so important that when you're thinking about graduate school, the mentorship match, because I was looking for someone who was going to allow me to do the work that I wanted to do, who would provide structure, but not restrict me. The type of person that I am, I need space to thrive. And the person that ended up being my mentor, Dr. Robert J. Green, I remember during my interview, he said, I study Black LGBT family. I mean, no, he said, I study LGBT families, white guy. He said, I study Black, I keep saying Black, I study Black LGBT. He kept saying, I study LGBT families. It's like, and I don't know much about Black gay men, and I don't know much about religion, but you seem like you do. And so therefore I believe in you, and I'm going to be here to support you, but I'm going to let you do what you do. And to me, that's what I needed. Some people need more structure. Some people need more hand holding, and that's fine. But that's never been me. And so the California School of Professional Psychology really gave me stellar clinical training and stellar research skills. So, let me go back because I do want to mention my clinical doctoral internship at the Richard Radabush VA. So this is the Indianapolis VA. And so this is part of the requirement for getting your PhD in clinical psychology, is doing a full-time internship. And so I did mine at the Indianapolis VA. And I'm actually writing a book about the experience now. It was the whole ordeal. But what I will say is, thinking about the journey, it was the pivotal part of my journey, because that's really where my mind started to click around this idea of decolonizing my thinking about psychology and about psychological science. Because I intentionally chose the VA because it's focused on clinical health psychology, but the Indianapolis VA, because at that time, again, all my training had happened in San Francisco. And so I was around people of color, I was around LGBTQ communities, and quite honestly, I wasn't sure if I could work with white people. In my mind, white people were from this privileged class. And I was like, can I even have empathy for them? Like, what do their problems look like in therapy? But being the type of person that I am, who is always about increasing my skill so that I can be better at the work I do, I said, that's horrible, oversight. I want to approach the issue. And so I want to be in a space that will allow me to work specifically with white heterosexual people. And so I chose the VA. But one of the things that really was interesting about that experience is that my clinical supervisors, who were all white, I was the only Black person, the only Black same gender loving person. And they kept saying, I'm sorry, we don't have more diversity for you. I'm sorry, we don't have more diversity for you. And that really shifted my thinking, because I said, I'm a Black same gender loving man. You all are different. I don't automatically know how to work with you. But it never occurred to them that a Black same gender loving man would be training to be a clinical psychologist in that program. In their mind, diversity meant training the white women who were in my cohort how to work with people like me, not how to train people like me how to work with white heterosexual people. And so that was the shift for me. And that's very influential in how I think about diversity, and equity, inclusion, and decolonizing psychological science today. So I just wanted to mention that. So, as a scientist, you're, you get the degree, but that's usually, not enough. You want to continue to hone your skills. So after I got my degree, I did my postdoctoral training in HIV prevention science in New York City at the Center for HIV Educational Studies and Training. And that was great. It was really great experience. It was a lot of BS, but it also a really great experience as well. It really taught me, as my therapist at the time said, how the sausage is made. and about the world of grants, which is a thing that it's a necessary evil when you're doing research. In academia anyway, you could do research without grants or with smaller grants if you're only doing it in the community. But in academia, part of your job is to get grants. And so this really helped me hone my skills in writing grants and writing research papers and really develop an identity for myself as a scientist who focuses on cultural factors and protective factors related to Black sexual and gender minority communities. After finishing my postdoc, I started my first faculty position, and I also became a visiting professor at at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, in their Center for AIDS Prevention Studies that provided additional training on grant writing. And I still have colleagues there at both of these places where I'm currently collaborating now on my research here at Rowan. So as you see, it's a long road. I just finished up the visiting professor program at UCSF the summer before I started here at Rowan. So that's a little bit about how I got here. So I want to talk a little bit now about what I do. And what I always say is that I'm a polymath that helps others heal and thrive. And I already mentioned that a polymath is a person of wide ranging knowledge or learning. And again, as I said, I encourage people to bring all of themselves to the work that they do. And I try to do that in my work. So I want to talk a little bit about how I do what I do. And so I want to talk a little bit about the philosophical assumptions and theoretical underpinnings of my work, because as you heard me talk about the early influences, right, that range from spirituality, religion, hip hop, to these Black pioneers, to my own journey with chronic illness, these things really influence all the work I do today as a researcher. So part of what I've been trying to do, which is tricky to do in a Eurocentric framework that predominates psychology and pretty much all science in the Western context. But what I've been trying to do is emancipate my work from a Eurocentric perspective. Again, which is not completely feasible because I have to translate my work for people that only have a Eurocentric perspective. But part of the ways I've been trying to emancipate it is by focusing on an Afrocentric perspective, which is a distinct discipline. African or Afrocentric psychology is distinct discipline from Eurocentric psychology. And so I've done this education, which is almost like a second PhD in and of itself, this education around Afrocentric psychology and trying to undergird my work, my clinical science work and my clinical work, but my clinical science research with the theories that predate Western thought. Right? People, that's one of the things that my colleagues and I talk about sometimes. Like, people act like nothing happened until Greece was on the scene. It was like, and the same thing in psychology, right? Until Wilhelm Wundt's lab got set up, no one was doing anything. It was like we didn't think about, what was going on in people's minds, what was going on with their mental health. It was like, yeah, people have been doing this stuff forever, right? And all this work started on the African continent where life began. And so Afrocentric psychology really centers those African values and principles and what it means to be holistic and mentally well from an Afrocentric perspective. Intersectionality theory also informs my work. So looking at not just race, but also social identities such as gender, class, able body status, so on and so forth. And also looking at how all of those identities at the individual level intersect with systems of oppression at a structural level. And then also looking at coping and stress as well. So how people cope and thrive with these systems of oppression and how it influences their health. and looking at society, community, relationship, and individual levels. So all of these things influence how I do the science that I do. So a word about spirituality. So I mentioned my religious upbringing. I personally do not identify as a religious person anymore, but I do still do very much identify as a spiritual person. And when I think about spirituality, it's in the ways in which it comes out in my work and with the participants that I'm doing, that I'm doing research with. When I'm talking about spirituality, I'm talking about a four-dimensional spirituality that again goes back to those Afrocentric roots that connects people with a underlying life force that is both connects them deeper with a higher power, if you will, with themselves, with the life force and non-human life forms, and all of humankind, including one's ancestors. So it is this multi-dimensional spirituality. So I just wanted to mention that. So, real briefly, I want to talk about some of what I study, and I'm looking at time, so I'm going to wrap it up. But what I really have been studying is again those intersections of spirituality and psychology and health. And so, how does spirituality influence people's Black sexual minority and gender minority people, as well as Black heterosexual people's understanding themselves and self concepts, as well as their health? So, these are some of the findings from the studies. You can go on my Google Scholar and see all of these. But I want to, I'm going to move past these really quickly to talk about some of the work that I've been doing since I started at Rowan, because these are opportunities for folks to connect with me, whether faculty or students. So at Rowan, what I really been looking at, again, influenced by the Afrocentric perspective of thinking about Ubuntu, which is a South African psychological value of the collective, meaning that I am because we are, right? So I've been looking at health in relationships. So particularly Black same-sex couples, relationship quality and health outcomes, continuing to try to define spirituality in a culturally specific way and how that influences the health of Black sexual minority men, and also starting to understand mind-body intervention. So things like yoga and mindfulness-based stress reduction, and this whole mindfulness movement that has this image that in the Western context looks like white women in Lululemon pants, right? But understanding how these modalities that predate all of that, right? And can influence the health of marginalized populations, particularly Black men. And so we're doing work in my lab currently, looking at cultural resilience for Black same-sex male couples and HIV prevention, looking at how Black same-sex male couples express their relationships online, on social media in particular. As far as spirituality and stress study, I'm currently doing a multi-method study looking at both qualitative and quantitative work, looking at how culturally specific spirituality influences health research and intervention design preferences for Black sexual minority men, and also looking at the associations of how culturally specific spirituality influences how men appraise intersectional stressors. I currently have a grant that's getting ready to go in, doing some of this cultural adaptation of mindfulness that I talked about. I'm also partnering with an international network of Black male yoga providers to understand the ways in which yoga can influence mind-body practices and health for Black men in particular. And so that's some of the work that I'm doing now. So during Q&A, feel free to ask me about any of that. So one of the things that I want to end with is that, you know, as Langston Hughes says, life for me ain't been no crystal stair, right? And I still have barriers as a scientist that I continue to come up against. And one of those is Eurocentricity. And again, because of the ways in which even when we're trying to make space for people of different diverse backgrounds, it's almost like trying to make space for them within the box that the systems understand. And the box that the systems understand is Eurocentricity. And so there's lots of things about what counts as legitimate scholarship is based in Eurocentricity. There's this bias for quantitative research versus qualitative research, so on and so forth. And there's these examples that I have on the screen are some examples of the particular examples I have of barriers that I've experienced. But again, I don't have the time to get into that right now. The other barrier that I focus is because my work is so strengths-based, is that the world of NIH and most of the funding mechanisms that fund researchers are focused on what's going wrong. They're focused on risk. They're focused on pathology. And so there's little space to really highlight those strengths and those resiliencies and the ways in which peoples resist and thrive in the midst of oppression that I talked about that influenced me from a very early age. So that was a lot. I thought I would have more time. That went by really fast. But I want to leave space for robust questions and answers. So yeah, I'm going to stop there. So I look forward to your questions. And feel free to reach out. There's a lot that we can discuss.
Yeah, I just want to encourage everyone to please go ahead and post some questions into the chat box, and we'll be happy to get them answered for you. Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Lassiter. That was just fascinating. You know, one of the things that a student had asked us is if you could tell us a little bit more about the mentors that helped you navigate your academic path. Like, how did you? And I do have to let you know that there's a lot of support for your kittens too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the mentors. So the mentors have been essential. And so my mentors have been, as I said, Dr. Robert J. Green, who was my academic advisor, who let me thrive. I always say he got out of my way. You know, he was not like, you know, you need to do this, you know, you need to study families, you need to do this. He was like, I don't know what you do, but you seem to know. I'm a researcher, I know how to do research. Go do what you want to do. And so that was so very much influential to me. The other, what I would say, hands-on mentor that I had is a mentor from undergrad, Dr. Dan Bauer, who's actually was in the English department of undergrad, but he was this white gay man, and he was one of the first people to take me under his wings. And I remember, like, it was the first time I had ever went to dinner at a professor's house, and he had books everywhere. And as a nerd, I was like, oh my God, I want my house to look like that. And you see the books behind me, they're over here now. And so, but he was the one that really put me up onto like the work of bell hooks, the Black feminist, Audre Lorde, and James Baldwin. And I remember like being like, wow, like all these Black people have written all these brilliant things. Like, I want to do this. So I would say it's actually two white gay men who were probably like the most influential mentors for me. They're very hands-on. And then of course I have these role models who are Black, same gender loving folks who also serve as mentors for me. But to this day, Dr. Green and Dr. Dan Bauer are always sending me emails about, here's this opportunity, you should do this, you should do that. Oh, you know, this grant's come down, you should do this. So they are very much still present in my life.
That's great. So a student asked a question that refers to an article that reports that minority doctoral students' primary stress surrounding constantly being reminded of their cultural differences during their doctoral studies. Was that your experience, and what feedback would you give to minority students navigating these stressors in today's context?
Yes. So the first thing I always say is get your degree. And I say that first because you can't make any change if you don't have the degree, because people don't want to listen to you because they think that you don't know anything because you don't have the degree, right? And so first off, do what you need to do to get your degree. But when it comes to navigating being in a space where people look at you different or make you feel your difference, one, own that difference. You are different, and that's a strength, and that's why you should be there more than some other folks maybe, right? And so own that difference and use it to your advantage. But I would also say that use it as your advantage by reconceptualizing yourself, because as Audre Lorde talks about difference isn't the issue, it's the ways in which we make values about difference, right? And so I would just encourage students to use the difference as a platform to do what you want to do.
Great. So another student asked, what kept you motivated throughout your journey?
So it's all those things that I mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, those books from a very early age of hearing about Black people working on behalf of Black communities, that was me. I was like, that's my motivation. I'm here. I remember being like in a seminar course in my senior year of undergrad, and it's a predominantly white institution. Everyone in class, except for me and my best friend Marquita, we're the only Black students in the class. And someone says, they're asking us what we want to do after we graduate that year. And I was like, I want to work with Black people. I was like, white people got enough people helping them, right? And so like that's the motivation. That's always been a motivation. And what keeps me going is, as I said, my spirituality, my family, but that drive.
Great. So in either research or clinical context, what are the largest barriers you've seen for those trying to rectify their sexuality and spirituality? For instance, young people struggling with those sometimes opposing identities, especially those evangelical or beginning to shift in their faith.
Yeah, that's a heavy question that I don't have time to do justice to. But what I will say is miseducation. Miseducation, I would say, is the biggest barrier. I remember I did a community town hall in Philly a few years back for Black Pride, and I was talking with another Black male scholar, and we were talking about Black LGBT communities, and someone said, they asked this question about Christianity and how homosexuality may be incompatible with Blackness. And I said, that's actually not true. If we go back to pre-colonial Africa, we actually understand that Europeans did not introduce homosexuality to the African continent, but what they introduced was homophobia via the ways in which the fluid sexuality became criminalized via the laws that European colonists interacted. But a lot of people don't know that, right? They don't have that knowledge. And again, this goes back to being a polymath, a person of wide-ranging knowledge, is that I read across disciplines, right? So what I'm talking about now is from anthropology, right? But if you don't have that knowledge and you're only in your little one box, then you're going to get confused and you're going to try to recreate the wheel.
Great. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us more about your qualitative research process? Like, how do you examine spirituality and health with this process? And what will this method provide that's not possible necessarily with the quantitative processes?
Right. So, I want to say that I don't try to pit qual versus quant. Both have their place, right? But what I will say for me, again, going back to my sort of value system and the focus on marginalized communities, is that so often marginalized communities do not get to speak for themselves. And so qualitative work allows marginalized communities to do that. Of course, it's being filtered through me as the researcher. As I tell the students in my lab, as qualitative researchers, we are the analytic tools, which is why it makes it so important for us to always be reflexive about our own processes, privileges, so on and so forth. But what I'm really trying to do with the qualitative work, particularly around spirituality and health right now, is to be culturally specific. There's so much talk about evidence-based practices, which are great, but evidence-based practices, if you look at the research, predominantly has been evidence-based with white populations. And so I'm like, okay, I'm cool with evidence-based practices, but there's also all this research about the lack of engagement with those evidence-based practices, the lack of utility. And so I'm trying to be culturally specific in my qualitative work. What are the things that people are saying themselves so that we could create interventions and ways of thinking about health and health treatment from the ground up for this particular group?
So recruiting from culturally marginalized populations is challenging for various reasons. How do you approach recruiting folks to your studies?
I love that question because people have been talking about that forever, right? There's all these papers on hidden populations, how to recruit from hidden populations. And I always, I get in my Toni Morrison mindset. When I remember attending a talk at New York Public Library around about 2014, and she was talking about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. When it came out, it was all the rage. And Toni Morrison said, invisible to whom? Right? And so when I hear people talk about hard to reach populations, I say hard to reach to whom? Right? And this is the importance of having cultural insiders doing the research, right? So who's on your team? So if your team is as diverse as you claim to be, right, as you hope to be, then it's not hard. You got to know where to go. You got to be connected. And that requires work, and that requires cultural humility. Because even as an insider, in some ways, as a Black same-gender loving man, there are ways in which I'm an outsider. And so I'm collaborating with people all the time who are of the community and in the community.
So I have a question. Let me just run through this. So what are your thoughts on the colonization of mindfulness by the West and needing to adapt it for Black same-gender loving men versus putting marginalized groups at the center and working with them to cultivate mindfulness, whatever that means to them?
Right. So the latter is what I'm trying to do. The former is what grant funding agencies will allow me to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So ideally, we're building from the ground up, but grant organizations are stuck in this box of Eurocentricity that says, but we have MBSR. What do you mean MBSR doesn't work? Why do we need to adapt it? So then you have to do all this work to show, actually it's not being utilized as much, and here's how we'll adapt it then.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have, we're coming to the end of our talk now. I think I might have time for one more question. If anyone wants to post one more question to us. I'm trying to see if I missed any. But it's been a fascinating talk. Your journey is amazing, and I'm so grateful for you for joining us and sharing your story. It's really refreshing to hear about all the sides of you and how you got to where you're going.
My pleasure. It's been a joy for me. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's really. I have someone who expressed it. Really enjoyed hearing your perspective, and thank you for taking your time with us. So with that, I'd like to adjourn our meeting, and thank you again, Dr. Lassiter.
Thank you.
So thanks for joining us, everyone, and please be on the lookout for our schedule for next year.